The first time I caught Florence Newberry glaring at my brand new wheelchair ramp like it had personally insulted her, I knew trouble was coming. I just didn't expect it to come so fast or so dirty. My name's Ryan O'Connell. I'm a 38-year-old veteran, and after an accident on duty, I've been using a wheelchair. A month ago, I finally moved into what I thought would be a peaceful neighborhood in Oak Ridge Estates. Quiet streets, decent people, or so I assumed. What I didn't know was that the HOA, led by Florence, treated the place like her personal kingdom. The ramp was installed the very week I moved in. Simple, sturdy, up to code. I even had the city inspector sign off on it. Still, Florence stomped over the moment she saw it, blonde bob bouncing with every furious step. "This is not approved by the HOA," she barked, waving a thick folder of bylaws like a weapon. "You need to remove it immediately or face fines." I stayed calm. "Florence, it's a federally protected right. The ADA permits reasonable accommodations like ramps. I even got city approval." Her nostrils flared like she was about to charge. "We have aesthetic standards. You're lowering property values." I wasn't about to back down. "You're welcome to take it up with my lawyer," I said and rolled back inside. I thought that would be the end of it. Wishful thinking. A few nights later, I heard a loud metallic crack from the front of my house. I rushed outside and found the ramp bent awkwardly, bolts loosened, and part of the support beam snapped clean in two. Someone had sabotaged it, and I didn't even have to guess who. A security cam I installed caught everything Florence, in her pink tracksuit, yanking at the bolts with a wrench like some deranged raccoon. I sat there, watching the footage on my laptop, my blood boiling. She could have killed me if the ramp collapsed while I was using it. This wasn't just petty anymore. It was criminal. The next morning, as I was documenting the damage, Florence strutted up my driveway, fake smile plastered across her face. "I hope you learned your lesson about following the rules, Ryan," she said sweetly, like she hadn't just committed a felony. I didn't say a word. I just stared at her, letting her dig her own grave, because I had already called my lawyer, and Florence Newberry was about to learn a very expensive lesson. By the time the patrol car pulled up, Florence was already gathering a small crowd on the sidewalk, arms crossed defiantly like she was the one under attack. I stayed by the porch, laptop balanced on my knees, evidence queued up and ready. The officer, a no-nonsense woman named Deputy Harris, stepped out and took one look at the mangled ramp and then at Florence, who immediately launched into a self-righteous tirade. "He's violating community standards. The structure isn't approved by the board." I was merely enforcing. Deputy Harris held up a hand, silencing her mid-squawk. "Ma'am, enforcement doesn't include criminal damage to private property. Let's take this one step at a time." She turned to me. "You said you had video?" Without a word, I hit play. The footage showed Florence creeping up the driveway like a cartoon villain, wrench in hand. The metal groaned under her assault, and her face twisted into a look of triumph when the beam snapped. Deputy Harris watched it all, eyebrows climbing higher with every second. When the video ended, she let out a low whistle. "Open and shut," she said. "Mr. O'Connell, would you like to press charges?" Florence's face drained of color. "You can't be serious. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association." Deputy Harris didn't miss a beat. "Which doesn't give you the right to destroy someone's property, especially something vital for accessibility. You're lucky he wasn't injured." Florence gaped like a fish, grasping for any excuse. "But the bylaws, the Americans with Disabilities Act trumps your bylaws," Deputy Harris said flatly. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back." The click of handcuffs echoed down the street. Neighbors who had been whispering now openly stared as Florence was led to the cruiser, her protests growing fainter as the doors shut. After giving my statement, I spent the rest of the day repairing what I could of the ramp with the help of a few neighbors who, it turned out, had their own grudges against Florence. Apparently, this wasn't her first power trip. Just the first time someone had caught her red-handed. The next morning, my lawyer, Andrea Patel, met me at the local courthouse. She carried herself with the kind of calm confidence that could make a lion back down. "We're filing a civil suit," Andrea said as we walked toward the clerk's office. "Destruction of property, emotional distress, violation of federal disability rights. And given the video evidence, we're looking at punitive damages too." I nodded, rolling along beside her. "How much do you think we're talking, considering the circumstances?" Andrea's smile was razor-sharp. "Easily 6 figures. As we finalized the paperwork, word spread quickly through Oak Ridge Estates. By the end of the week, Florence had posted bail but faced not only my lawsuit but also criminal charges of vandalism and reckless endangerment. Her once loyal board members started backing away, desperate to avoid the fallout. A special meeting was called to discuss Florence's position. I wasn't planning to attend, but Andrea insisted. "You need to show them you're not just some pushover," she said. "Besides, it'll be fun." The community center was packed. Folding chairs lined up in chaotic rows, residents murmuring and glancing nervously at the front table where the remaining board members sat stiffly. Florence, out on bail, sat hunched in a corner, her usual commanding aura reduced to a sulky shadow. When I entered, the room went quiet. Some people looked away, ashamed. Others nodded in solidarity. I made my way to the front and waited for the meeting to start. It didn't take long. One of the board members, a wiry man named Harold Finch, cleared his throat. "In light of recent events, we are voting to remove Florence Newberry from her position as HOA president, effective immediately." No one objected. Florence stood up suddenly, knocking her chair over. "You're all cowards. I did what none of you had the spine to do. I protected our community." An older woman in the front row, who I later learned was Mrs. Alvarez, shook her head. "You endangered someone's life over a ramp. You humiliated all of us." Someone else muttered, "About time she got what she deserved." Florence stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the windows. No one went after her. After the meeting, Harold approached me, hands wringing nervously. "Mr. O'Connell, on behalf of the board and honestly, the community, we're sorry. We allowed her too much power for too long." I studied him for a long moment. "Then fix it," I said. "Make sure what happened to me never happens to anyone else." He nodded fervently. "We will. We're already drafting new policies." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. Andrea kept me updated as Florence's legal troubles mounted. The HOA's insurance refused to cover her defense, arguing that her actions were personal and malicious. She was on her own. Meanwhile, the repairs to my ramp were fully funded by the HOA, who also agreed to pay for additional security cameras around my property as a gesture of goodwill. The board even passed a new resolution ensuring that any future accessibility modifications would be fast-tracked and protected. When the civil case finally went to court, Florence tried to play the victim, claimed she was only protecting the integrity of the neighborhood, but the judge wasn't buying it. Andrea presented the video evidence, along with expert testimony about the dangers sabotaged ramps pose to wheelchair users. She also introduced statements from other residents about Florence's history of intimidation. Florence's attorney tried to argue that the damage wasn't intentional, that it was an overzealous attempt at enforcement, but the footage was clear. So was the fact that she had used a heavy-duty wrench to do it. The verdict was swift and brutal. The jury awarded me substantial damages, compensation for the ramp, punitive damages for Florence's reckless endangerment, and an additional sum for emotional distress. Altogether, it totaled nearly $200,000. Florence paled when the amount was read. Her hands trembled as she gripped the table, realizing she would likely have to sell her home to even come close to paying it. After the trial, Andrea and I stood on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. "Justice served," she said, sliding her sunglasses on. I looked out over the parking lot, watching Florence slump into the passenger seat of an aging sedan, driven by a man I assumed was her brother. "No chauffeur-driven Lexus today." "Yeah," I said, "and not just for me." Back home, the neighborhood had changed. People who used to avoid eye contact now waved as I passed. Mrs. Alvarez brought over homemade empanadas. Kids chalked colorful drawings on the sidewalk near my house, and no one said a word about aesthetic standards. The new board even asked if I would consider running for a seat in the next election. I politely declined. I hadn't moved here to become a politician. I had moved here to live. And now, finally, I could. About a month after the lawsuit ended, I noticed a black SUV idling across the street from my house. It wasn't the first time. Over the past week, the same vehicle had shown up at odd hours, sitting there for 10, sometimes 15 minutes before pulling away. At first, I thought it might be someone lost or casing the neighborhood. But when I rolled outside one evening to get my mail and the SUV peeled off the moment I appeared, I knew it wasn't random. The next day, I mentioned it to Andrea over coffee at the local diner. She set her cup down with a soft clink, her eyes narrowing. "You think Florence is trying to intimidate you?" she asked, voice low. I shrugged. Wouldn't put it past her. She's got a lot of anger and not a lot of places to put it. Andrea tapped her nails against the tabletop, thinking, let's not wait for something worse to happen. I'll file for a restraining order. We'll also notify the authorities about the stalking. 2 days later, Deputy Harris returned to my doorstep, this time with a partner. After reviewing the footage from my security cameras, which, thankfully, now covered every angle of my property, they agreed it warranted action. They managed to track the vehicle's registration back to Florence's cousin, a wiry man named Leonard who lived 2 towns over. When confronted, Leonard admitted Florence had asked him to keep an eye on me, claiming I was planning to sue the HOA again. It was a weak excuse, and Deputy Harris wasn't buying it. They issued a warning, and Andrea filed the necessary paperwork to keep Florence and anyone acting on her behalf at a legal distance. I thought that would be the end of it, but Florence had one last disaster up her sleeve. One evening, after a long day volunteering at a local Veterans Resource Center, I rounded the corner toward my house and stopped dead in the street. Flames licked the side of my front yard. My newly replanted flower beds were torched, and the remains of a gasoline can sat at the edge of the grass. Neighbors were already rushing out with garden hoses, trying to douse the fire before it reached the house. I wheeled over as fast as I could, heart hammering. Thankfully, the flames hadn't reached the ramp or the porch. But the clear intention wasn't just vandalism anymore. It was arson. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Fire trucks arrived, and within minutes, the blaze was extinguished. One of the firefighters, a tall man with soot streaked across his forehead, crouched down beside me. "You're lucky," he said. "If this had happened an hour later, with the wind picking up, your entire house could have gone up." Deputy Harris showed up not long after, her face grim as she inspected the scene. "This isn't petty harassment anymore," she said. "This is felony arson." Investigators spent hours combing through the damage. They pulled fingerprints off the gasoline can and found clear shoe prints leading from the burn patch to the sidewalk. The prints matched a pair of sneakers Florence had worn to one of the HOA meetings, confirmed by multiple witnesses and security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera. A week later, Florence was arrested again, this time in front of the grocery store, her cart half full of frozen dinners and cheap wine. The charges were serious enough that her bond was set astronomically high, and she couldn't pay it. At the preliminary hearing, her attorney attempted to argue that there was no direct evidence proving Florence had lit the fire herself. But the prosecutor brought up the surveillance footage, shoe print matches, and Leonard's earlier admission about the SUV stalking. The judge wasn't impressed by the defense's attempt to paint Florence as a misunderstood community leader. Andrea leaned over during the hearing and whispered, "She's not walking away from this." Florence sat at the defense table, her face drawn and pale, flinching with every new piece of evidence presented. There was no trace of the woman who once barked orders across the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the new HOA board decided they needed to do damage control. Harold Finch showed up at my door one afternoon, clutching a file folder and looking like he hadn't slept in days. "We're offering a formal apology," he said, voice tight. "And we're establishing a fund to cover not just your landscaping repairs, but to install additional fire safety measures around your home at no cost." I let him stand there in uncomfortable silence for a moment before nodding. "Good. But you also need to overhaul your entire enforcement process. No more unchecked authority." Harold agreed. The board scheduled a series of open forums, inviting every homeowner to propose changes. They hired an external mediator to oversee meetings, ensuring transparency. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't operating like a shadow government, but like an actual democratic organization. Meanwhile, Andrea filed a second civil suit against Florence, this time for attempted arson and emotional distress. Given the criminal charges pending against her, Florence had no choice but to settle. Her insurance company flat out refused to cover her legal expenses, citing intentional criminal acts as an exclusion. The settlement was massive. Between the two cases, Florence owed me nearly $400,000. She was forced to sell her house at a loss to cover the payments. Word spread quickly, and not just through Oak Ridge Estates. Local news picked up the story. Veteran defends home against HOA president turned arsonist. One afternoon, a news crew even showed up outside my house. I agreed to a short interview, making sure to focus on the larger issue, unchecked HOA power and the importance of standing up for your rights. I didn't move into this neighborhood to fight a war. I said into the microphone, the late sun casting long shadows behind me. I just wanted a home, and no one should have to battle for the basic right to live safely and freely. After the cameras packed up and the reporter thanked me, Mrs. Alvarez walked over carrying a tray of lemon bars. She looked more relaxed than I had ever seen her. "You did good, Mijo," she said, handing me the tray. "Wouldn't have done it without this community stepping up," I replied. Around us, the neighborhood was changing. People were organizing block parties, painting murals, planting gardens together. Oak Ridge Estates was finally becoming the kind of place it had pretended to be all along. As for Florence, the last I heard, she was living with a distant relative in another county, working part-time at a discount furniture store. Her name was poison around here. No one wanted anything to do with her. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun sink low, Andrea pulled up in her car. She got out, waving a bottle of sparkling cider. "Thought we should celebrate," she said, popping the cork with a satisfying crack. We sat there, sipping the cider, watching kids ride their bikes up and down the street. No one yelled at them about chalk drawings. No one threatened fines over slightly overgrown bushes. "You know," Andrea said, tilting her head thoughtfully, "you could still run for the board. They'd welcome you with open arms." I laughed. "I think I've had enough politics for one lifetime." She grinned, raising her glass. "To peace, then." "To peace," I echoed, clinking my glass against hers. And for the first time in a long while, it wasn't just wishful thinking. It was real. The morning after Andrea and I toasted on the porch, I woke to the sound of hammering across the street. Harold and a few other board members were erecting a new community bulletin board at the entrance to Oak Ridge Estates, a symbol of the transparency they had promised. It was odd, seeing real change take root in a place that once thrived on fear and silence. I spent the afternoon at the VA hospital, dropping off care packages the community had put together. When I returned, there was a registered letter waiting on my porch, tucked neatly under a rock. I opened it cautiously. It was from the district attorney's office. Florence had pleaded guilty to felony vandalism and reckless endangerment as part of a deal to avoid a trial for the arson charges. She would serve 18 months under house arrest, prohibited from setting foot anywhere near Oak Ridge Estates. The letter also included a note. If I wished, I could submit a victim impact statement that would be read at her sentencing hearing. I stared at the paper for a long time, weighing the idea. That evening, as the neighborhood kids played tag under the blooming magnolias, I sat down at my kitchen table and began to write. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courtroom felt colder, more sterile than I remembered. Florence shuffled in wearing an ankle monitor, her once immaculate appearance replaced by a wrinkled blouse and scuffed shoes. She didn't look at anyone. She barely looked at the judge. When it was my turn, I wheeled up to the podium, my statement folded neatly in my lap. The room was silent, the weight of months of tension pressing down. I moved to Oak Ridge Estates because I wanted a home where I could heal. I began, my voice steady. Instead, I found someone so obsessed with control that she endangered my life. Florence shifted uncomfortably, but I pressed on. I could have been killed when my ramp was sabotaged. I could have lost everything when my yard was set on fire. All because someone decided that my existence didn't fit their vision of perfect. I paused, letting the words settle. But I'm still here. And the community you tried to tear apart? It's stronger now than it's ever been. Thanks to you, we learned how important it is to stand up, to protect each other. I finished, folded the paper, and rolled back to my seat. The judge thanked me, his expression unreadable. When Florence spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She apologized, but it felt mechanical, like someone reading from a script they didn't believe in. The judge wasn't moved. He sentenced her to 18 months of house arrest, 5 years probation, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from contacting me or any member of the Oak Ridge Estates HOA. She was also ordered to attend mandatory counseling sessions for anger management and community service assisting disabled veterans, a condition Andrea had suggested to the prosecutor personally. After the sentencing, as the courtroom emptied, a few residents of Oak Ridge Estates approached me. Harold was among them, carrying a battered notebook filled with ideas for more community projects. "We're organizing a fundraiser for the local VA hospital," he said, adjusting his glasses. "We thought maybe you could help us coordinate it." I smiled. I'd be honored. The months that followed felt like a different lifetime. The fundraiser was a massive success. Families donated homemade goods, local businesses chipped in prizes for a charity raffle, and the event ended with a fireworks show that lit up the warm summer sky. One evening, Mrs. Alvarez invited me to a barbecue at her house. As I rolled up her driveway, I noticed a new addition to her front yard, a small, hand-painted sign that read, "Welcome all neighbors." It was a simple gesture, but it carried more meaning than she probably realized. Over burgers and lemonade, Harold pulled me aside. "We're amending the HOA charter," he said, voice low but excited. "We're putting in strict limits on board authority. No more unchecked fines. No more secret meetings. Everything will be voted on by the homeowners." I nodded appreciatively. "About time." "You know," Harold added, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening, "we're also naming the new community garden after you." I nearly choked on my lemonade. "You don't have to do that." He grinned. "We want to. After everything, it just feels right." The dedication ceremony was small but heartfelt. Mrs. Alvarez gave a short speech in Spanish, then translated it herself, her voice thick with emotion. As they unveiled the simple wooden sign, "O'Connell Garden," I felt something shift inside me. Not closure, exactly. More like a door opening. Later that night, as I sat on my porch watching the stars blink to life, Andrea pulled up again, this time in a different car, a battered old Jeep. She had been restoring herself. She handed me a worn leather folder. "Told you I'd keep an eye out for opportunities," she said. Inside was an application to serve on the city's Accessibility Advisory Board, a group that worked with local government to ensure public spaces met ADA standards. "You'd be perfect for it," Andrea said, settling into the chair beside me. "And after what you did here, you've got the experience." I turned the application over in my hands, considering. It wasn't what I had planned for my life, but then again, neither was any of this. Maybe it was time to turn all the chaos into something bigger. "You know," I said, glancing at the horizon where the last traces of sunset clung to the sky, "I think I will." As the crickets sang and the breeze stirred the trees, I filled out the application right there on the porch, the soft scratch of the pen marking the beginning of something new. Florence's shadow no longer loomed over Oak Ridge Estates. It had taken months of battles, courtrooms, and more stress than I cared to remember, but in the end, the community she tried to control had found its voice. And so had I.